Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is my second follow-up video to the discussion with some Christians on the concept of Herem as a form of human sacrifice. This video will provide some clarity on the meaning of Herem in Isaiah 34. First, let us listen to what our Christian guest Luis Dizon said about Isaiah 34 during the discussion in response to me.
Now we can go to Isaiah chapter 34, which is the other passage that was mentioned in the context of this discussion. Now, our interlocutor has stated that the herem and the sacrifice are equated here, but as we shall shortly see, that is not the case. So first, let's look at the one verse that actually mentions the herem. Hiketzef la'Adonai al kol hagoyim v'chema al kol tzva'a herimam natanam letavach. Okay, so in the English translation, for the Lord is angry at all the nations, furious at all their hosts. He has proscribed or doomed them, consigned them to slaughter. So who is the object of the herem in this case? It is the nations and all of their hosts. Okay, so make note of that. You have the verb, which is the haram verb, and then the object of that verb is the nations. Now let's go to verse 6. Which is the passage that has sacrifice mentioned in it. Cherev la'Adonai mal Adam hudashna mechelev midam karim va'atudim mechelev kiliot elim ki zevach la'Adonai bevatzra v'tevach gadol be'eretz Edom. The Lord has a sword. It is sated with blood. It is gorged with fat, the blood of lambs and he-goats, the kidney fat of rams. For the Lord holds a sacrifice in Botzra, a great slaughter in the land of Edom. Okay, so now we have sacrifice here. Now, here's the question. What is the object of the sacrifice? If we look at the verse, it's clear what is being sacrificed here. You have lambs, he-goats, rams. And then you have in verse 7 continues, wild oxen shall fall with them, young bulls with mighty steers, and their land shall be drunk with blood, and their soil shall be saturated with fat. So if you look closely, even though herem and zevach occur in the same passage, they're not being used with the same objects. Herem is what the God does to the nations, but zevach is what God does to the animals. So rather than these two terms being equated, the two actions are being done to two different objects. All right, so it's clear here that zevach and herem are being treated as two distinct actions. Okay, so you're saying then that the princes are being sacrificed in verse 7.
Yes, because that's what it says in verse 6.
All right, so you're saying that the wild oxen, the mighty bulls, they're a metaphor for the princes, okay? So here's my next question. Is the sacrifice language in verse 6 literal?
Q, I don't mean to interrupt, but just to know, read with that verse right there you're quoting, that's literally a parallelism. It's when you're referring one or two or three sayings in some, but they're all in reference to the same thing. So
sorry, so the reference to what?
What's using right here between 5 and 6 all the way to 7, that's parallelism.
Okay, so the discussion ended up centering around whether the animals mentioned in verses 6 and 7 were meant to be literal sacrificial animals that would be literally sacrificed to Yahweh, or if they were meant to be metaphors for human beings facing the judgment of Yahweh. I had mentioned during the talk that sacrificial animals were used as obvious metaphors for humans in Ezekiel 39, specifically as metaphors for the armies of Gog and Magog. So there is such a precedent. Notice also how the killing of these metaphorical rams, lambs, and he-goats is associated with a sacrificial feast. However, originally I had said that the animals in Isaiah 34 verse 6 were literal sacrificial lambs, goats, and rams, while the animals in verse 7 were metaphors. One of the Christian guests, Steve, rightly pointed out that there is parallelism in these verses. So one verse cannot be literal and the other metaphorical. They both must be either one or the other. If I concede this point, which I do, it only further strengthens the Herem as human sacrifice argument. This is evident by the plain reading of the text. Verse 5 talks about the judgment coming upon Edom and its people. Would it make sense for the text to then abruptly shift to talking about the sacrificing of animals in Edom? It is clear that the animals in verse 6 are meant to be metaphors for the people in Edom, Edom itself serving as a symbol for all the sinful nations of the world. Notice that the Lord has a sword in verse 6, and then he has a sacrifice in the capital city of Basra. Then in verse 7, it mentions some other types of animals which would also die in the coming slaughter. How can this be referring to literal animals? Indeed, if we compare verse 3, which refers to the dead people among the Edomites, to verse 7, the language is very similar and gory. It's a bloodbath. Now, let's look at some commentaries to aid in our endeavor. In his commentary on Isaiah 34, the late biblical scholar Hans Wildberger stated the following: the author compares the great slaughter that will commence in Edom to a festival offering, cf. Jeremiah 46:10, a passage on which the present text is possibly dependent. There as well, the day of Yahweh is called a day of retribution. The message includes the description that the sword devours, and a sacrifice for Yahweh is announced. A gigantic frenzy of offerings is depicted, at which not only lambs, he-goats, and rams will be brought forth, but also wild oxen, cattle that are being fattened, young cows, and mighty steers. All will be part of this activity as well. Note the clear sacrificial language. But there's another very important point that must be made to refute Luis and Co.'s claims that the animals are not metaphors for humans, but rather literal sacrificial animals. Isaiah 34:7 mentions the wild oxen that shall fall with them, or what Wildberger rendered as young steers. The Hebrew word in question is ra'em. It would be strange to refer to this animal for the purpose of a sacrifice, since, as Wildberger observed, it is never used for sacrifices in the Bible. Rather, a ra'em is used as a symbol of strength. So these animals simply cannot be literal sacrificial animals in Isaiah 34:7. They are symbols for human strength. The meaning is that even the strongest Edomites will fall. This is confirmed by virtually every Christian commentary. There is apparent agreement that verses 6 through 7 use animal imagery as metaphors for humans. I have examined several such commentaries. For example, Ellison's commentary for English readers states that the fierce wild beasts stand for the chiefs of the Edomites. Similarly, the Benson commentary states that the bulls and, quote, unicorns, or perhaps rhinoceroses, the ESV calls them the wild oxen, or ra'em, are metaphors for princes and potentates. Not only that, but they, along with the, quote, inferior people, i.e. the lambs, goats, and rams, from verse 6, will be sacrificed. Finally, Matthew Henry's concise commentary explained that the verses concerned all nations. There's no mention of the sacrificial animals being literal animals. But that's just 3 commentaries. As I said, I had examined several commentaries. Let's compare the number of commentaries that I examined, both Christian and Jewish, that state that the animals are metaphors for humans versus those that say that they are literal sacrificial animals. First, for team metaphors for humans, and now team literal sacrificial animals. I looked far and wide for any commentary that would join team literal sacrificial animals, but to no avail. This does not mean that there aren't any. but it does seem to show near unanimous consensus that verses 6 through 7 are to be interpreted metaphorically. This is perhaps why the New International Reader's Version of the Bible renders verses 6 through 7 as follows. His sword will be red with blood. It will be covered with fat. The blood will flow like the blood of lambs and goats being sacrificed. The fat will be like the fat taken from the kidneys of rams. That's because the Lord will offer a sacrifice in the city of Basra. He will kill many people in the land of Edom. The people and their leaders will be killed, like wild oxen and young bulls. In reality, we do not need the commentaries to help us. Simply reading the text in context will do the job. We can also compare the language of Isaiah 34 to Jeremiah 46, verse 10. This was a point I made during the discussion with Luis and Steve. In both verses, the Lord has a sword that will be sated with blood, and he will have a sacrifice. The only difference is the place where the sacrifice will be held. In Isaiah 34, it is Edom. In Jeremiah 46, it is in the north country by the river Euphrates. One final point. During his presentation, Luis has cited the theological workbook of the Old Testament to help define the meaning of Herem. But what does the same source say about the Zevach? Echoing the claim of Steve, Zevach can mean simply slaughter without any sacrificial context. This is the claim that Stephen made about Jeremiah 46:10. The theological workbook of the Old Testament does say this, that the word for sacrifice occasionally also means slaughter without any sacrificial context. However, in the very next paragraph, it states, the ideas of slaughter and sacrifice are powerfully combined in passages portraying divine judgment. Which passages? It names several. It also states the day of the Lord is described as a sacrifice, as princes and armies are destroyed. A time of slaughter was in store for Israel, Egypt, and Edom. Notice it mentions Jeremiah 46:10 and Isaiah 34:6. It also mentions Ezekiel 39, the armies of Gog and Magog being sacrificed as well. Note also that it says that the language metaphorically refers to the sacrifice of princes and armies, not literal sacrificial animals like goats and rams. Given the strong sacrificial language in Isaiah 34, where the sinful nations are placed under the Herem, it is difficult to argue that a form of human sacrifice is not implied. So with all due respect to Luis and Steve, they are plain wrong. Isaiah 34 does use sacrificial language for the sinful nations that are placed under the Herem. They are placed under the ban, devoted to be destroyed, and also sacrificed. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
وقل جاء الحق وزهق الباطل إن الباطل كان زهوقا